yesterday as time goes. Not so very long ago, more than half of our people lived in small towns similar to this one or on farms. The towns were Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn types of towns, with shady streets, the corner store, the picket fence. Most people said that the big city was a nice place to visit, but you certainly wouldn't want to live there. The fact is that today, more and more people are living there, making our cities even bigger, changing our way of life from the small towns of yesterday. Hello, I'm George Stone. I think it's pretty obvious to most of us that we have large cities, but what we don't realize is that they're probably bigger than we think and growing at tremendous speed. The fact is that these large metropolitan areas are not just small towns grown up. Because of their size, they've evolved a whole new set of characteristics hitherto unknown, new kinds of problems to be dealt with. We're becoming increasingly aware that the unique problems posed by these expanding areas are of concern to ourselves and our society. Problems of transportation. How do we get large numbers of people and vehicles to and from 1 million destinations? Problems of housing, slum clearance, urban renewal, problems of immigration, of education, of water supply. In order to cope effectively and soundly with the large metropolitan area, we must be able not only to see the emergence of the phenomenon, but to be able to take it apart and study its details. And here is where the big count of the Bureau of the Census comes into the picture. And our expert for that is Dr. Philip M. Hauser, professor of sociology and director of the Population Research and Training Center at the University of Chicago. Doctor, could we say that the growth of these giant metropolitan centers is a relatively new development?
Well, you certainly can. And not only that, so is the concentration of the American people even in urban places. And the census, as you're aware, defines urban places as places having 2,500 or more persons. Let's look at the situation historically. Here in the chart before us, we can see that back in 1800, only about 6% of the American people lived in such urban places. And by 1950, almost two-thirds of our people, 64%, lived in such places. And this transition, incidentally, is one of the most profound things that has ever happened to the American people, because this has brought about a great alteration in our patterns of thought and our patterns of action. Should this trend continue, we would find that by 1980, just about 3/4 of all the American people would be living in such urban places.
Now, you talk about urban places. Isn't that a term which can include everything from Cairo, Illinois to New York City? What about the differences in size of urban places? Doesn't that matter, Doctor?
Well, it certainly does. And as a matter of fact, we find that the urban may be subdivided into cities 100,000 and over and other urban. Now, we notice that back in 1850, cities of 100,000 or more contained only about 5% of the American people. But by 1950, cities of this size included about 30% of all the folks in the United States. And should this trend continue, then by 1980, it is possible that cities of 100,000 and over will have something like 1/3 of all the American people. Now, notice that the rural category is not completely homogeneous. It can be subdivided. And this line here indicates the rural farm population. In 1910, people who lived on farms made up about 35% of the total American people. But by 1950, that had decreased to only 14%. And should this trend continue, it is possible that by 1980, farm population may be as low as about 7 or 8% of the total population of the United States.
Then this urban section up here is not just one big block under one label, but a number of separate areas with individual characteristics, depending upon what you happen to be looking for.
Precisely. And as a matter of fact, that urban block contains as many as almost 5,000 separate urban places distributed throughout the nation. And would you imagine that these 5,000 places had any particular order, system with respect to size and rank?
No, I shouldn't imagine so. I rather think they just grew like topsy.
Well, in some respects they did. Yet the remarkable thing is that despite the fact that our urban places have grown literally as a result of billions of decisions made by millions of individual citizens, businessmen, government officials, and the like, there's a very definite order and pattern in their distribution throughout the country.
Well, in what way, Doctor?
Well, this chart before us shows us the urbanized areas of the United States. And urbanized areas, as defined by the census, is a central city of 50,000 or more, and all adjoining area with a population density heavy enough to require living in city block patterns. Actually, a density of 500 dwelling units, or about 2,000 persons per square mile. Now, the order in these urbanized areas is given by the formula which I'm placing here. You will notice SR is equal to S sub 1 R, which means that the size of a given city or urbanized area, the given rank, is equal to the size of the very largest of the urbanized areas divided by the rank of the city.
I'm not quite sure I understand that.
Well, let me make it clear this way. Take Chicago. It's the second in the order of the urbanized area. The population of Chicago is therefore equal to New York divided by 2. Take Los Angeles. It's the third of the urbanized areas in rank order. The population of Los Angeles, therefore, is equal to New York divided by 3. And this order holds clear down through all of our urbanized areas, and believe it or not, the same system is observable in every one of the 17 censuses we've taken to date.
It's almost as though somebody planned it that way.
But
I'm sure no one did.
No one did.
Well, why does this work?
Well, we wish we knew. This itself is still a subject for research, but we know the order is there. And what it shows is that despite the decentralized process by which our cities have their origin and development, there is a very definite play of forces creating system and order in the entire set of cities.
Let's talk about the characteristics of the population in these cities, if we can, Doctor. Now, granted that a way of life will differ from the country to the city, how about the difference between cities? I mean, is it likely that I'll have, say, a different job or status if I choose to live in St. Louis rather than New York City, aside from the regional influences involved?
Well, you may well have. And the reason is that the characteristics of a population differ a great deal with the size of the place. For example, in the materials which are before us, we can see that the sex ratio varies considerably by size of place.
Well, if I may interject here, I'd like to know, first of all, what is the sex ratio?
Well, by sex ratio, we refer to the number of men per 100 women. Now, the horizontal line on this chart indicates the sex ratio for the United States as a whole. And each of the little bars, starting on the left, stands for a different size place. The bar on the extreme left for urbanized areas of 3 million or more population. And then down to the bar at the extreme right, which indicates the sex ratio for the rural farm area. Now notice, the population in urban places is not only below that of the country as a whole in respect of sex ratio, but actually all urban places have more men, or more women, that is, than men. In contrast, it is only in the rural part of the United States, the rural farm and rural non-farm area, that the sex ratio is not only above the average for the country, but actually there is an excess of men over women. Now, similarly, if we consider the age of a population, we find that the median age, that is the average age, varies by the size of the place. The larger the place, the higher the age. The smaller the place, the younger is the population. And with one exception. You'll notice the small town bar protruding above the average bar for the United States has a higher age on the right, because in that particular case that indicates the farmer tends to go to the small town for retirement. And finally, as another illustration of differences, we see the size of the place affects the birth rate. For example, the larger the place, the smaller the birth rate, the farther it is below the national average. The smaller the place, the higher the birth rate, as indicated by the fertility ratio, which is a measure of the number of children under 5 per 1,000 women of childbearing age. And so on with respect to other characteristics. We find considerable differences in the character of the population by the size of the place.
Doctor, as a big city resident, having more women come into my way of life is not at all a disturbing thought. But I'm not so sure I'm happy about what age might do. If I want to escape the long arm of urbanization, I suppose the thing for me to do is to return to the soil, huh?
Well, I'm afraid that's a lot easier to talk about than to do.
Oh, is it?
Because you'd sure be bucking the national trend. You see, the rural farm population's continuing to decrease. In 1910, there were 35 million people living in rural farm areas. By 1950, as reported by the Census, this number had shrunk to about 22 million. As a matter of fact, by 1958, to around 20 million. And it's altogether possible by 1980 that our rural farm population may number as few as 15 million people.
Well, from this, I get a sort of a picture of the large urban areas just gradually reaching out and devouring the suburbs, the exurbs, and even the smaller urban areas, until what we're left with, well, will be just a number of super cities across the country.
Well, that's not an inaccurate picture. Let's take a look at it. Here we have a chart that shows the standard metropolitan area population, SMA. Now, standard metropolitan area is defined by the census as any central city of 50,000 or more, the county in which it's located, and in such adjoining counties whose populations depend on that central city, really, for making a living. Now, notice, in 1900, areas which would qualify as standard metropolitan areas contained about 25 million people, 1/3 of the population of the United States. But by 1950, they contained some 85 million people, 57% of the population of the nation. In fact, between 1900 and 1950, while the population of the nation as a whole doubled, the population outside of metropolitan areas increased by only 50%, and the population within metropolitan areas tripled. Should this trend continue, by 1950 to 1980, the metropolitan area populations will almost double, will increase by some 80 million people. That is, by 1980, it is possible that there will be 165 million people concentrated in something like over 200 standard metropolitan areas. And by the way, the fact that this is not only a trend but a rapidly accelerating trend is indicated by these considerations. Between 1900 and 1950, our metropolitan areas absorbed 73% of the total growth of the nation. Between 1940 and 1950, the metropolitan areas absorbed some 81% of total population growth. And between 1950 and 1955, our standard metropolitan areas absorbed 97% of the total population growth of the United States.
Sounds a little crowded to me, Doctor.
Yes.
What's the reason for this trend toward agglomeration of population on our landscape?
Well, obviously, this is an ecological manifestation of our form of technological development and economic organization.
Yeah, I understand that perfectly. What does it mean?
Well, if I can get away from some of this professorial gobbledygook...
I hope you do.
Let me put it this way. We're getting an increasing concentration of our population in a relatively small number of standard metropolitan areas because this clumping of people and activities represents the most efficient producer and consumer unit that we've yet managed to devise. That is, a concentration of people tends to minimize the frictions of space and communication, makes possible a great division of labor and specialization, which of course are responsible in large measure for increased productivity. That, along with the introduction of non-human energy and the machine. All of this adds up to a way of saying that this trend towards increased concentration of our people may be expected to continue because this underpins the high level of living of the American people.
I'm mighty glad you straightened that out. I wasn't with you before at all. Now, we're entering the second area in this study, the problems brought up by the urbanization process. Perhaps you can tell us how the census figures can help in solving urban problems,
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, the figures we've been discussing up to this point are themselves illustrative and an answer to your question. That is, in indicating the rapidity with which urbanization is proceeding, we are in fact getting facts to enable government, business, labor, the citizenry at large, to anticipate and cope with the enormous rates of growth and frictions of growth which the figures reveal. Other data will indicate a good deal about the process of decentralization, about the aging of the city, about a deteriorating housing plan, about problems of congestion and traffic, about the people who inhabit areas and problems, therefore, of intergroup relations. That is, census data of these types provide every sector of our society with basic information with which to anticipate and better to deal with the problems of urban living.
You mentioned people a moment ago now. You've said that more and more people are streaming into these large areas, but how does that fit in with the flight to the suburbs that I've heard so much about? Do the two balance each other out?
Well, they're not as contradictory as may seem at first blush. As a matter of fact, there's nothing new about the flight to the suburbs. People have been moving outward from the center of the city as long as we've had cities, as we'll indicate in just a moment. But it is true that there is increasing decentralization of population. Now, if you look at the distribution of population for the nation as a whole, we're struck with the fact of concentration. That is, more and more of our people living in these great standard metropolitan areas. But if you focus on the population in a given metropolitan area, then it's increasingly clear that within the metropolitan area, people are becoming decentralized in the sense that larger and larger proportions of them live in the suburbs outside the central cities.
It all sounds as though I should have known the answer before, the way you put it, Doctor. Well, now, about this exodus to the suburbs, even to exurbia and interurbia, what are the facts in this case, Doctor?
Well, they're shown on the chart here, which indicates this center line indicating the growth of central cities, and the lower line indicating the growth of suburban rings outside the central cities. Now, if we compare the rate of growth in suburbs with the rate of growth of population in central cities over the first half of this decade, then it turns out that suburban populations grew about 1/3 times as fast as that in central cities. In the last 10 years of this period, between 1940 and 1950 that is, suburban populations grew 2.5 times as fast as that in central cities. Whereas between 1950 and 1955, suburban populations grew 7 times as fast as those in central cities. Or another way to look at this process of decentralization, in the first half of this century, the suburbs absorbed 45% of the total population growth of metropolitan areas. In the last 10 years of that period, between 1940 and 1950, the suburbs absorbed some 61% of the total metropolitan area growth.
Golly, what must the picture be for the future, then?
Right. Well, between 50 and 55, the suburbs absorbed over 80% of total metropolitan area growth. And if we look to the future, should this trend continue, then between 1950 and 1980, the population of central cities will increase by only about 16 million. But the population of our outlying metropolitan rings will increase by 64 million people. That is, while central cities are increasing by about 30%, our suburban populations will increase by about 180%, almost triple.
Well, one of the problems of the city is overpopulation. If so many people are moving out into the fringes, it must indicate there's no room in the central area. How about that for an astute observation?
Well, I think it's an astute one, and one often overlooked, as a matter of fact, because the basic reason for the decentralization are perhaps two. The first is our shift from 19th to 20th century technology. That is, the 19th century technology, in response to which most of our metropolitan areas and cities have developed their present structure. 19th century technology was symbolized by the steam engine, the belt and the pulley, the horse-drawn vehicle. Now, this technology set centripetal forces into motion, which put population tightly around factory plants. Now, 20th century technology, in contrast, is symbolized by electric power, by the automobile, the truck, and the highway, and by the telephone. This makes it possible to disperse population over much wider distances across the landscape. And perhaps another more significant way of saying it is that 20th century technology makes possible much larger agglomerations of population than were ever possible before. Now, couple this with the fact that our cities have relatively fixed political boundaries, set down in a charter by state legislature whose creatures our cities are. And the fact that the whole agglomeration continues to grow, the central city is filled up because it reaches its boundaries, necessarily suburban growth must be greater. That is, the growth must necessarily be on the outside.
Urban sprawl is a term that I've heard used to describe this suburban growth. As a matter of fact, the way the suburbs are growing is not unlike the knight who mounted his horse and rode madly off in all directions at once.
Yes, I think this reference to localIdentifier is probably well put, because much of our suburban developments are in fact unplanned, are done without regard to proper zoning and codes, and have led writers and observers of the scene to refer to the urban sprawl. But actually, despite this appearance of disorder, there's considerable system and order to the development of all of our metropolitan areas. Come, let's take a look at it. If we use as an example, say, the way in which metropolitan Chicago grew, this happens to be my hometown. We see here the Lake Michigan to the east. Every metropolitan area has some center, some point encompassing its original economic function where it originates. In Chicago, this was given by the junction of the Chicago River and Lake Michigan, because this break in bulk transport gave Chicago its first economic function. Now, from this point, the city grew outward to the west, to the north, to the south, and for rather obvious reasons, not so much to the east. Now, this growth was accompanied by significant developments with respect to the distribution of population, because as the city grew outward, obviously the newer and more desirable housing was always that most distantly removed from the center of the city. The older and less desirable housing was always that closest to the center of the city. And in consequence, if I may use some sociological language, the population was stratified in space by social economic status. That is, them as had it tended to live farther out where the housing was more desirable. Them as didn't lived inside in the older and the less desirable type of housing.
Then as the city grew and grew until people began spilling over its political boundaries into the areas that became known as the suburbs.
That's right. And we can see the pattern manifested here on the maps which are before us. For example, we find that as the cities grew, the older sections tended to deteriorate, the newer sections being more desirable. And the dark spot on this map indicates the percentage of dwelling units without running water which are dilapidated. This is the section of the city associated with slum. Notice that in the next map, it is the light shade that is toward the center of the city, because this is a map that is showing median income of families in Chicago. And the dark spots are in the outlying sections of the city. The dark shades indicate that the people with higher income live outside and away from the center of the city. Now, this process indicates a very interesting thing about neighborhoods throughout metropolitan USA. If you consider the inner zone of a neighborhood or of a metropolitan area, it turns out every one of our neighborhoods has had a natural history, so to speak. That is, at first, it tended to be an outlying part of the community and was a place of residence for the fashionably elite. As time went on, the metropolitan area continued to grow and envelop this elite suburb. What would happen is that the fashionable elite would move further out, and this place became occupied by, say, middle-class people. And so, as the metropolitan area continued to grow, it next became an area of residence of working men, and eventually perhaps of slums. Now, every one of the inner zones of our metropolitan areas have had such a natural history. And this, incidentally, is what has really brought about the urban renewal program.
Mm-hmm. Well, in other words, Doctor, as I understand it now, if we were to control or in some way alter this thing you call the natural history of the neighborhood, we'd be able to prevent blight and the development of slums.
Well, precisely. And as a matter of fact, our urban renewal program might be considered in this light. Our free market enterprise system produced for the American people the highest mass level of living ever achieved in the history of man. But it had certain costs and frictions. One of these was the slum, which became a matter of national and international disgrace as well as a matter of national politics. Now, with urban renewal, what we're in effect doing is going back to the inner, the older, the decayed sections of our city and cleaning up some of the mess, so to speak, that we created in a hurry to get where we are. Moreover, as you know, the program includes not only slum clearance, but also various measures of conservation to conserve the older, middle-aged sections of our city, and measures to prevent blight throughout the metropolitan area.
Wouldn't another problem in this same instance be that this decay and blight eventually will find its way across the boundaries of the city and start defacing the suburbs?
Well, you needn't say eventually. It's already there.
Oh?
In fact, it's a rather interesting thing that the suburbs are now experiencing the explosive growth of the type that our central cities did during the 19th and early 20th century. And in consequence, they're also experiencing some of the fabulous decay that our central cities did.
I suppose that's inevitable.
Right. Moreover, consider this. As you know, increasingly, industry is becoming located in the suburbs for the same reason that people are. The central city is filled up. And around some of these industrial developments, we're beginning to get relatively cheap housing developments without regard not only what they do to adjoining communities, but to the needs of the community itself. Drainage, adequate water supply, educational facilities, and the like. And in good measure, part of what's going on in suburban USA today is resulting in slum almost before the concrete is dry. And should these trends continue, it may well be that we're turning our metropolitan areas inside out. The suburbs may have larger proportions of slum than the central cities in the coming decades.
Not a very happy prospect. I think, Doctor, that we've set up this urbanization, covered its growth and the attendant problems pretty well today. What sort of a prospect for tomorrow can you give us in this important area?
Well, the trends that we've described may be expected to continue. That is, we can look forward to the continued increasing concentration of the American people in a relatively small number of metropolitan areas. We can look forward to continued decentralization of population within them. The census data will reveal and continue to reveal the aging of various sections of our cities, the need for the types of measures introduced by urban renewal. Moreover, the kinds of information made available by the census about the people and the actual peopling of our metropolitan area is doing much to help illuminate problems of intergroup relations. That is, the basic trends we've described are in motion. They may be expected to continue. And the kind of information the census gets, of course, helps us better to understand and deal with these problems.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hauser. And the statistics from the big count, the census, have helped us to better understand this feature of the American scene. Statistics on population, housing, transportation, education. The census, in providing these data, makes possible an effective and sound approach to the problems of urbanization.
This is National Educational Television.